We began Deuteronomy chapter 22 last week, and we're going to continue it today. And the first part of the chapter addresses a series of laws on what the Apostle James calls true religion, meaning the proper spiritual attitude that a disciple of the God of Israel employs when observing God's laws and commandments. It's also a call to holiness and to exhibit the spirit of the law, rather than to just mechanically performing it to the letter. The key to always remember in our discussions of the Torah and the law is it's only for those who've already been redeemed. The Torah and the law were given to Israel after their redemption, not as a means of redemption. Thus, following the law code of the Torah is not how redemption is achieved. It's simply the proper response that is expected by God as a result of the redemption that He's given to us by grace as a free gift, first to Israel down in Egypt, later to all who trust in Messiah. Now, because cultures change and evolve over time, it's the principles of these commandments that we must apprehend and then reapply to our present state. It's not always easy to determine how to do that. And so reasonable debate and disagreements to be expected. But what is not debatable is that these laws and commandments remain just as Yeshua said they did in his Sermon on the Mount as recorded in Matthew 5. Now, we ended our last lesson by discussing the concept of illicit mixtures, which is defined as the creation of unlawful unions between things that a worshiper of Jehovah ought not to do. And from a biblical viewpoint, the definition of adultery is an illicit mixture, an unlawful union. So while we think of adultery as a crime that revolves around sexual issues, in fact, even the Webster's Dictionary makes it clear that to adulterate something means merely to mix the pure with the impure, the inferior with the superior, no matter what the material might be. In the Lord's eyes, adultery means to mix the holy with the unholy, the clean with the unclean, the righteous with the unrighteous. The illustrations given in the Bible were transvestism, in this case men disguising themselves as women and vice versa, planting two different kinds of seeds together, mixing two types of thread, specifically linen and wool, to form cloth for use as a garment, and the yoking of two different kinds and sizes of animals together to a plow. So let's reread a portion of Deuteronomy 22 to set the stage. Open your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 22. We're going to start at verse 12. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, that's on page 221. And we'll read from 12 through the end. You are to make for yourself twisted cords on the four corners of the garment you wrap around yourself. If a man marries a woman, has sexual relations with her, and then, having come to dislike her, brings false charges against her and defames her character by saying, I married this woman, but when I had intercourse with her, I did not find evidence that she was a virgin. Then the girl's father and mother are to take the evidence of the girl's virginity to the leaders of the town at the gate. The girl's father will say to the leaders, I let my daughter marry this man, but he hates her. So he's brought false charges that he didn't find any evidence of her virginity, yet here is the evidence of my daughter's virginity, and they will lay the cloth before the town leaders. The leaders of that town are to take the man and punish him, and fine him 2.5 pounds of silver shekels, which they will give to the girl's father, because he has publicly defamed a virgin of Israel. She will remain his wife, and he is forbidden from divorcing her as long as he lives. But if the charge is substantiated, that the evidence for the girl's virginity could not be found, then they are to lead the girl to the door of her father's house, and the men of the town will stone her to death, because she has committed in Israel the disgraceful act of being a prostitute while in her father's house. In this way you will put an end to such wickedness among you. If a man is found sleeping with a woman who has a husband, both of them must die. The man who went to bed with the woman and the woman too. In this way you'll expel such wickedness from Israel. If a girl who's a virgin is engaged to a man, and another man comes upon her in the town and has relations with her, you are to bring them both out to the gate of the city and stone them to death. The girl because she didn't cry out for help there in the city, and the man because he has humiliated his neighbor's wife. In this way you will put an end to such wickedness among you. If the man comes upon the engaged girl out in the countryside, and the man grabs her and has sexual relations with her, then only the man who had intercourse with her is to die. You will do nothing to the girl, because she's done nothing deserving of death. The situation is like the case of the man who attacks his neighbor and kills him. For he found her in the countryside, and the engaged girl cried out, but there was no one to save her. If a man comes upon a girl who's a virgin but who is not engaged, he grabs her, has sexual relations with her, and they are caught in the act. Then the man who had intercourse with her must give to the girl's father 1 1/4 pounds of silver shekels. She will become his wife. Because he humiliated her, he may not divorce her as long as he lives. Now, I ended the last lesson by pointing out that Jewish and Christian scholars and teachers and leaders have tried all manner of reason to explain the why behind the Lord choosing the animals and materials and actions that he did, and then dividing them into categories of clean and unclean, and lawful and unlawful, acceptable, unacceptable. And in all the studies I've ever done on the matter, I've not found one explanation of God's supposed rationale for his choices, or some kind of logical, rational system within those choices that stands up to close scrutiny. Exactly why a sheep is okay to sacrifice and to eat, but a pig isn't, is not clear. Why a cloven hoof or chewing the cud makes such a difference in the ritual status of the animal doesn't compute. Why is a turtle dove okay to sacrifice, but a chicken isn't? Doesn't seem to fit any discernible model. Why are frogs off limits? Why is sex out of wedlock prohibited, if you want to get down to it? In Deuteronomy 22, I asked the question, does weaving together linen and wool supernaturally create an evil cloth? Does planting corn and cucumbers next to one another make them both inedible? My conclusion on the matter is that while these laws and commandments most certainly are meant to be taken seriously, as is, the much larger, higher issue is that these are all illustrations of God's divine principles. He has created things in a certain order, each for a certain purpose, and to adulterate this order, or to try to reorder his creation and purposes, is wrong. It's called sin. It should be avoided. And the search for why is certainly an understandable endeavor. But it is completely secondary to our actually observing, if not the literal law, then the clear principle that it demonstrates. As the great Hebrew sage Rashi said, we don't know, we don't have to know why the command is as it is in order to obey it. Let me make some connections, and in so doing point out why we need to adopt Rashi's attitude towards obeying God's commandments. First, in the laws of prohibiting wearing a garment of mixed linen and wool, this only applies to certain individuals in the Israeli community, not all of them. priests who were on duty were actually required to wear certain clothing items that were made from a mixture of wool and linen. It was only lay people, non-priests, who could not wear cloth of that sort. Further, there is no law against merely the weaving together of linen and wool. It's only the wearing of it as a garment that presents the issue. Theoretically, one could make a grain sack, make a tent out of that same mixed fabric, and it's fine. Therefore, if it were that spontaneous evil erupted when you mixed linen and wool together, then there is no way that the Lord would have compelled his own set-apart servants, the priests, to wear some of it. Interestingly, there was an item to be worn by all Hebrews that did consist of this otherwise outlawed mixture of wool and linen. Tzitzit, tassels. Verse 12 of Deuteronomy 22 makes it a law for all Hebrews to wear these tassels. And when we go back to Numbers 15, and then study the most ancient works of the sages, we find out just how these tassels were to be constructed. They were to be made out of linen threads with one wool thread, a blue one, added to it. So traditional tzitzit are made out of a mixture of wool and linen that for other uses and purposes is prohibited for the laymen of Israel. And by the way, as one might expect, not all sects of Judaism are in agreement on that issue. The Hebrew word for cloth made out of linen and wool is shanez. Shanez. Now, shanez is usually translated as mixed material. And that's a pretty good translation. But it's key to remember that these laws of illicit mixing are all about the seventh commandment, adultery. That's what they all point back to. Thus, we find that while shatnez is most literally may mean mixed material, in fact, the common usage and sense of that term carried a much different message. Shatnez is a Hebrew idiom used for prostitution. More specifically, in the biblical era, a prostitute wore shatnez, clothing made of mixed material of wool and linen. Now, don't let that confuse you, but instead enlighten, because most every language does the same thing. It says one thing, but at certain times a string of words used in a particular circumstance means something of its own. We're just so immersed into our own language and culture with its own idioms that we unconsciously use them, but we don't see what we're saying. For instance, in English, we'll hear a juicy rumor like, "Ooh, I hear your friend Steve is sleeping with that girl Connie." Now, of course, we all know we're not talking about sleeping here. But what did the word say? That's not what they meant. We know what they meant. If 1,000 years from now somebody stumbled upon that statement, they'd wonder what the big deal was. So, everybody has to sleep. Since when's sleeping such a bad thing? What possible harm or evil could be in that? Not even 100 years ago, by the way. In America, as elsewhere, it was completely common for men and women unmarried in some cases. Other cases, barely acquaintances, to sleep several to a bed. I said sleep. It was no different then than for a bunch of people sleeping in sleeping bags around a campfire. See, it's just that in our culture, those words don't mean exactly what they say. They indicate something else that people outside our culture probably wouldn't catch, or sometimes younger people in our culture. We were sitting around the dinner table the other day, and my wife said to our granddaughter, "Well, don't let the cat out of the bag." And she looked at her and said, "What do you, Grandma? We don't have a cat." She's 13 years old. She'd never heard that before. It's the same idea with the Hebrew word shatnez, mixed material. The implication of the word shatnez was understood among ancient Hebrews. Literally, what this law says, you shall not wear shatnez, wool and linen together. Simple enough. You don't wear mixed wool and linen for whatever God's reason is. But that's not what it meant. What it meant to the Israelites of that Bible is, you shall not wear the clothes of a prostitute, which are wool and linen together. That's what it meant. A prostitute in ancient times wore lovely clothes, expensive perfumes, because that's what helped to entice her very stinky male customers. The finest cloth in that era was often a mixture of wool and linen. The wealthy pagans routinely wore this material. So here is a direct understanding among the ancient Hebrews that mixing wool and linen for use as a garment among lay people was symbolic of prostitution, because that's actually what prostitutes in that era wore. But it was also symbolic of what prostitution essentially is in a much deeper sense. It is by definition a form of adultery. Adultery is effectively an unauthorized union. An unauthorized union is an illicit mixture, and therefore any illicit mixture is simply an act of adultery before the Lord. And that, my friends, is a very important biblical principle for us to grasp as we read the words of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. So what we see is that while a mixture of wool and linen is usually thought of as being a cloth that God completely prohibits, and we make the wrong assumption that it is inherently evil to do so, that is simply not true to the words and commandments of the Torah. The scriptures make it clear that God's priests can and must wear some of their garments made of linen and wool. By the way, you find that back in Exodus 28. In addition, some items of a priest's clothing are to be wool only. Some items of his garment are to be linen only. And out of the example of the tzitzit, this shows us that even lay people can wear something made out of this mixed material, even though tzitzit can't be truly classified as a garment, but rather it's a symbol. So, what we see is that clean and unclean unions, acceptable and unacceptable mixtures, have not only to do with what the materials or the mixtures are, but the circumstance, even who's involved. I want to be clear. This does not give us license to simply apply circumstances willy-nilly so that we can rationalize our behavior. The Torah gives us a good deal of information so we can understand the purpose and the spirit behind these laws. Many Orthodox Jews today, by the way, do not include that blue woolen thread in their tzitzit. Very few. Instead, they'll make the tzitzit entirely from wool. They say it's because they aren't sure exactly what the color of blue was that was to be used for the thread. So they just leave it out altogether. Yet here we see in Deuteronomy 22 that while the color of the woolen thread does play a role, the far bigger issue is the mixing of the two materials. So in my mind, to leave out the linen just because the exact shade of blue isn't so certain misses the whole purpose and spirit of the law of the tzitzit. Now, folks, this is where Jews and Christians can get so far off beam so easily. Jews can go astray by setting aside Scripture in favor of tradition that is primarily the commentary and rulings of rabbis and religious authorities. Christians, we can get off beam by setting aside Scripture, or even just simply the entire Old Testament, in favor of doctrines and denominational customs set down by our religious leadership. We get so focused on doing good things that we forget the love and mercy with which we are expected to salt everything that we attempt. On the one hand, we get so focused on love and mercy that we declare everyone and everything good so that we can be peaceful with it. And we wind up putting God's obedience to God's laws and commandments on the shelf. So, I have a question for those of you who, like me, consider the New Testament admonition that we as believers in Messiah Yeshua are priests of the Lord to be true. And that God sees us as His set-apart servants in this era. That as believers, we're to be teachers of the Word, as well as those who observe the Word. We're also to give the Lord our sacrifices, which in this case is our wills. We're to give Him a sacrifice of praise with our lips. Further, we're to consider ourselves as sort of lesser priests, working for and taking our direction from our high priest, Christ. We're to anoint with oil. We're to pray for the needs of others. All things that prior to Yeshua were reserved as a function of the priesthood of Israel, as ordained by God. 1 Peter 2:9. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people called for God's own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who has called you out of the darkness and into His marvelous light. Since priests were not only allowed, but ordered to wear certain articles of clothing that had a mixture of shanez, linen, and wool, should we shun wearing it, as many in the Jewish community do? Some believers today strongly believe that to wear a mixture of linen and wool garments is wrong. Those who typically scoff at that idea, however, almost unanimously say that the reason we don't have to is because the law is dead and gone, and we don't have to observe anything. Now, I think that those at both ends of the spectrum on that issue need to reconsider. As a member of God's royal priesthood, I am fully authorized by Torah and by the author of Torah, Yeshua our Messiah, to wear a mixture of linen and wool. I recognize that I'm far more of a spiritual priest of God than I am an earthly priest, in the sense that, as far as I know, I'm not a physical descendant of Jacob, let alone Aaron, who formed the Israelite priesthood, yet I and you do have physical earthly duties, and my actions and attitude and spirit ought to at all times reflect God's view that I'm His servant. I'm His priest. I'm set apart only for Him. And since I am made holy and set apart for Him, that means, here's the kicker, what I join myself to, what I mix myself with, who and what I come into union with, oh, that's got to be carefully considered. I can give you countless examples of this in the New Testament. What I'm hoping is that we continue to discuss human sexuality, illicit mixtures and such, that you will see that the principles for all of this are laid down in the Torah. And that's where we're going to gain our greatest understanding of illegal and legal unions. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 is almost exclusively about proper versus improper mixtures. As one tiny example. Here is Paul pleading in 1 Corinthians 6:16. Don't you know that a man who joins himself to a prostitute becomes physically one with her? For the Tanakh says the two will become one flesh. Here he gives the prohibition against an unlawful union between a person who has been made holy and clean with a person who is not holy and is unclean. And then in the next verse, he gives the rationale for this view in the positive form. But the person who is joined to the Lord is one spirit with him. So there's both sides of the coin. In other words, as with all illicit mixtures, the concept is that a person who is set apart for God has no business coming into contact or into unions with those things and people who are not. It's not what we should do. We should not mix where it's unauthorized. To do so is essentially to adulterate what at one time was pure. Now, we not only adulterate the laws of God when we do that, but we also adulterate our personal relationship with God. I know that this is really tough. It's not my rules that I'm telling you about. I'm just telling you the scripture. And with all my being, I believe what I'm telling you is fully the context and fully what's being communicated to us, whether we particularly like it or not. Well, we've lightly touched on human sexuality issues that I told you last week were going to challenge us. Now it starts to heat up. And I want to say to you right up front that it is an unfortunate irony that believers have to face the seedy side of human sexuality relentlessly. And so do our children. From billboards to magazine ads to our TV programs, advertisements, and movies, to revealing clothing, to openly gay relationships, and so on. We just don't seem to have any means to escape it. And yet, the sections of God's Word that instructs on the subject of human sexuality are regularly shunned in a church environment because it's just considered too delicate and embarrassing. If ever there is a proper source, a proper understanding of what is and is not the good and godly purposes of human sexuality that He created, it's in the Bible. And the main place in the Bible that spells it out is the Torah. And we're not going to go around it. We're going to deal with it frankly. Because that's how the Lord gave it to us. So, beginning in verse 13 are a few examples of relationships, or better, unions, between men and women, of which some are right, some are wrong, and then how it affects those involved with them. And the first case is of a man who falsely accuses a woman of being unchaste prior to their being married. Now, to put it more directly, a husband marries a woman, decides to accuse her of having sexual relations with another man prior to their engagement. Now, in our society, that is considered virtually normal. And generally speaking, is no reason for concern by a bridegroom. In fact, a girl, I think, today who's not had relations prior to engagement is seen kind of as ignorant, prudish, and a little bit backwards. And among her peers, usually not very cool. Very sad. She's made fun of. She's scorned by her friends, considered strange and abnormal. So in our time, a girl like this might actually keep her virginity a secret because she doesn't want to be embarrassed about it. Nothing could be more opposite of God's commandments. The first example is really fascinating. A man marries a woman, decides he doesn't want her anymore. And what it says in verse 13 is that he hates her. Now, hate doesn't mean he's developed some intense emotional dislike for her. It means that he rejects her for whatever the reason is. We're not given it. And since the law only has the narrowest of reasons for permitting divorce, and apparently the husband doesn't have one of those reasons, he makes up a false accusation. And if this accusation were true, which in this case it was not, it indeed constitutes a legal reason to get rid of this wife. And the husband's reason for wanting a divorce is he's discovered that his woman was not a virgin when he married her. He defames her. He announces publicly his complaint, and of course this causes an enormous loss of honor for both his wife and her family, especially this girl's father. I can't overstate that. That is huge. So a standard cultural solution to the problem now unwinds before us in this law. To counter these charges, the mother and father then bring the proof of the girl's virginity to those who are empowered to judge the matter, which are the city's elders. This verse speaks of the elders being located at the city gate. And I've mentioned a few times, court was usually held next to the main entry gates of a city, if it's a walled city. And in that era, the area next to the gates was where a town's main courtyard was located. It was where businessmen would congregate, strangers would stop and be questioned by law enforcement, marriage ceremonies would occur, and that's also where the local court met. The idea was all these things were to be publicly witnessed. The father now speaks. He says, that dastardly man he gave his daughter to has rejected her for no good reason, and he's made up a false charge of fornication to divorce her. However, indeed the father and the mother do have the required evidence to prove this girl's virginity prior to betrothal. And the required evidence is called the marriage cloth, or marriage garment, or some term referring to a piece of cloth that had a very important role in that era in the marriage process. Again, I can't overstate the seriousness of this matter. A girl who's been found to have had sexual relations prior to betrothal in that era could be stoned to death. The father is disgraced at such a horrible act by the daughter because it was his job to protect and supervise her until he turned the authority over her to another man, her husband. I mean, the shame of this is beyond enormous. It will affect this family for generations to come. Further, because it was customary for a substantial monetary price to be paid by the suitor to the father, as what's called a bride price, the father would have to give it back. And in most cases, this could be a significant setback on the family's finances. The husband certainly wanted his money back. Why? Because he's going to need it for another bride. Besides, he feels he's been defrauded. Now, before we go any farther, I want to define a couple of terms. First, we find the term virgin used often in the Bible. In the modern era, this refers to a woman who's never had sexual relations with a man. In the Bible, it meant primarily a girl who's never been married. Of course, what is part and parcel of a girl never being married is that she's never had sexual relations and she's still living at home under her father's authority and protection. Because girls usually married by around the age of 15 in this era. It also meant that these were young girls. Only rarely might a girl have reached her 20s and still be single and living with her parents by then. Now, second is this issue of the marriage cloth, which in Hebrew is called a simlah. Now, in Israelite culture, and according to biblical law, the first step towards marriage was for it to be arranged between the father and the potential bridegroom. Once agreed to, a price was paid by the bridegroom. Once that happened and money exchanged hands, that meant the couple was betrothed. Done deal. The status of betrothed made the couple, for all practical purposes, married. Betrothal was not extended or serious dating. This was not a time when the parties could reasonably change their minds. To break an engagement required a really good legal reason. Only one thing separated the betrothed from being officially married: consummation. That's it. Usually a very simple and quick marriage ceremony occurred on that day. The man then took his bride and they had union. Only upon this was the couple legally married. That's it. Done. But during the wedding night, the consummation was to occur while the couple lay together upon a clean cloth. In earlier times, it was not a cloth like a sheet or a blanket, simply a new and clean undergarment. Only later did it become normal for it to just be a special cloth that was used for this purpose. Before its intended use, it was turned over to specially selected elder women to verify it was completely clean, unsoiled, and most important, unspotted. Because this was about to become a very important piece of legal evidence. Because the girl was young, had never had relations, who expected that some bleeding would occur. I don't need to go into all of that. You already know it. But the smear would be on the clean cloth, and voila, we have the proof that the girl was a virgin. But what happened if in the morning there wasn't any smear? To the husband of that era, it was proof his new wife had not remained pure prior to their betrothal. Oh, now we have trouble. We got big trouble. So the following morning, if everything went as planned, the girl would proudly present the stained marriage cloth to her mother and father as proof she'd been a good and faithful daughter. The parents would then in turn, oh, you're going to love this, proudly display it in their home. Show all the well-wishers, all the family and friends that an honorable marriage had occurred. Their girl had been a good girl. Now today, we've switched. We now have 8x10 glossies of the wedding. Right? It's about as far as we want to go. I told you this got dicey. Well, after a time, the cloth was carefully stored away. It became a permanent evidentiary document, just in case a thing as what we're talking about here actually happened. That explains the need for the elder women to confirm the unstained nature of the cloth before it was used so they could testify to it. After all, the woman knew full well if she was virgin or not, and might have prepared a pre-stained cloth for that case if she wasn't. At least that was the mindset of it. Anyway, the cloth is all the proof. That's it. The elders need. The husband is judged a liar, and his punishment is appropriately severe. Now first, by definition, his dishonesty and untrustworthiness is exposed for everybody to see. Second, he's to be publicly punished by being whipped. Next, he's to pay the father a penalty of 100 silver shekels, a substantial amount of money for that era. And as the coup de grace, not only can the man not divorce the woman as he'd planned to, for whatever his reasons were, no matter what happens in the future, it doesn't matter what, he can never divorce her. It doesn't matter what she does. He's stuck with her. Now let me add that it was recognized by all that there are a number of circumstances whereby this wedding night scenario might not go the way it should, and it's no fault on anybody's part. Therefore, we find rabbinical rulings that might require a physical examination by the elder women so that they can be a witness to determine if there's any need for alarm here. Well, now, the second case illustration begins in verse 20, and it's basically the same except that it turns out the husband's allegations are true. Should the bride be found to have had intimate relations before marriage, she's taken to the doorstep of her father's house, and there she's executed by stoning. Not executed by her parents, but by the community. I suppose we could argue that this is unfair. It's way too severe. But recall earlier in the previous chapter that a rebellious son faced basically the same consequence. The primary way a daughter could be rebellious is by refusing her father's supervision, cavorting with men she's not been betrothed to, and thus bringing great dishonor to her household. The ultimate girl child rebellion is to have intimate relations before betrothal. The ultimate boy child rebellion is to be a no account, to be a glutton, a fool, a drunkard. Therefore, God's justice is equal. Death for both. And again, in both cases, the reason for this terrible price is stated. It shall purge evil from Israel. Now, the crime the girl committed is in Hebrew is called behaving as a zonah. It means behaving as a prostitute. And while in the West, we give this act the designation of fornication, and a lot of Bibles translate it that way. In fact, that word covers over the point. The very meaning of the act of prostitution is about physical union. It's all about illicit mixture. It's all about an unauthorized union. And all illicit unions are a form of adultery. So while we tend to make a distinction in modern society between the terms fornication and adultery, it's all contained under the same biblical God principle. It's all part of the seventh commandment. Now, following this is the third example. That of a man committing adultery with a married woman. And this case is pretty straightforward. If it proves true, both of them are executed. No favoritism here. So the fourth example is contained in verses 23 and 24. It's the case of a betrothed girl who has sex not with the man she's betrothed to, but with another one. Again, the penalty for both participants is death. Because except for the act of consummation between bride and bridegroom under the law, there is almost no difference between betrothal and marriage. So the penalty is the same as for the married woman who consorts with a man not her husband, because this is, once again, a violation of the seventh commandment against adultery. Now, there are some caveats in this case brought about by circumstances. This is a situation that occurs in a city. Cities in ancient times were densely populated. The wall of one house was usually built incorporating the wall of the neighboring house, exactly like an apartment building or a condominium. Water and roads determined as much as anything where a city was built. So a suitable place existed such that availability of water and the security of having several families in one place was important. Therefore, that's where a town would grow up. The idea is that an attack upon a girl within a city is practically impossible to go unnoticed. An unwilling woman would have cried out. Somebody would have heard her. Maybe to rescue her, maybe simply to later testify that she did cry out. But the crying out was the indication that this was the case of an unwilling woman. This was not, whatever was happening, it wasn't consensual. Without other evidence to the contrary, that no one heard her cry out means she didn't protest sufficiently. Therefore, she's assumed to be guilty of willing participation. This is adultery. So that her and the man's life is forfeit. The idea here is one of reasonable resistance. No resistance, no excuse. However, as it says in verse 25, when the location of the same kind of crime is out in the countryside, where homes might be a long way apart, while the girl's protest could very possibly never be heard, If she claims she's not willingly participating, her word is taken for it. She's innocent. He's guilty. That's it. He's done for. And the final case is of a man who has relations with a girl who is neither married nor betrothed. And we see an interesting shift in the penalty. Death is not prescribed for either. The best way to compare this to modern times is that the unattached teen girl living at home has a date with a guy and they foolishly decide to become intimate. And while this is anything but ideal, this union is not authorized. It does not, however, carry the same weight as for a person who is married. And the end result is they must marry. Why? Because God's rules are such that a willing union by a man and a woman who isn't a prostitute indicates marriage. A girl has decided she wants to have that male an authority over her, so now it's transferred from her father to this man. The Lord says that a man who has union with a woman who is otherwise not committed to another man has engaged in marriage. Now he's responsible for her. Therefore, as it says in verse 29, the man must pay the father now a bride price. And it says the price is 50 silver shekels. That's a high price, probably higher than usual, actually. Not as high as the penalty the husband paid for falsely accusing his new wife of having not been a virgin. On the other hand, the man in this case has forever taken away the girl's virgin status. Therefore, there's very little chance that father could ever marry this girl off in the future. That would mean he'd never receive the money for a bride price. Now, in addition to this man being required to marry the girl, he will never have the right to divorce her in the future. I don't care how egregious of an act this woman might perform. Doesn't matter. Now, there's so much for us to take from all this. So I want to just summarize this lesson as we get near the end by just pointing out a few things. We'll call it a day. When we hold up the state of our culture, in light of these laws, we have utterly no grounds to stand on to plead that we ought to be treated differently collectively according to God's justice because we are a so-called Christian nation, absolutely brimming with churches and synagogues. We are, as they say, guilty of sin. We're as guilty as if we were a nation of atheists. Perhaps even more so because we know the truth, and we often just choose to ignore it. Second of all, a father has the duty to protect the women living under his roof. This is not a macho ideal. This is not some quaint societal demand. Men, this is our role as men, ordained by the God who created us as males. God has put women under our authority, not as chattel, not as slaves, not as less than us, but He makes their responsibility, He makes their welfare our responsibility. The sexual conduct of our children is not to be left to the school system to teach or to dispense their secular humanist viewpoints of human sexuality. I don't know to what length a father and a mother ought to go today to protect against this. But anything inside the laws of our society need to be considered. We also need to see that while the illicit sexual behavior that takes place here has its own consequences, Christ makes something very clear. It all begins in our minds. Our bodies are slaves to our minds. Whether it is a girl deciding to treat her body as that of a prostitute, or a man deciding to act as a rapist, or of two consenting adults engaging in an illicit sexual union, it begins with the thought of it. Therefore, that's why Yeshua says that a man but looking at a woman in lust, meaning he's already formed the idea of his intentions upon her in his mind. And that's step one. He's already committing adultery. 4. While we have had the examples of animals yoked together, seeds planted together, two kinds of thread woven together, the deception of a man disguising himself as a woman, no act of illicit mixture is as serious as the act of unlawful intimate union between a human male and female. Paul argued that the physical body of a believer is to be considered as the temple of the Holy Spirit of God, and we had better treat it accordingly. To violate that temple, to violate God's sanctuary, oh my goodness, that's a terrible thing. Now we still have a long way to go with Moses' Sermon on the Mount involving human sexuality and illicit mixtures, because it is such a serious topic with far-reaching effects. But this closes out chapter 22. Next week, we'll begin Deuteronomy 23. Please rise.
Yeshua.